Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globuspan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globuspan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globuspan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globuspan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
So welcome viewers and listeners to another edition of Globuspan 24/7. Globuspan is owned and operated by Mr. Noor Singh. And as usual, Mr. Devin Bissoon is the technical operator. Tonight, I am just a moderator of tonight's discussion, Road to 2025 Elections and Alleged Corruption. We have an esteemed team of panelists this evening. We have GHK Lal, who is no stranger to this program. In fact, none of the presenters is any stranger to this program. So we have the GHK Lal, a very prolific writer in Guyana's media. Counsel Timothy Jonas, Senior Counsel in Guyana, and the General Secretary of ANUG. And we have a very towering personality, Professor Terence Blackman of Medgar Evers. Gentlemen, thank you all very, very much for taking your very invaluable time from your proceedings in this very hot summer in New York and in Guyana as well, to join us for this discussion, Road Towards 2025 Elections and Alleged Corruption. So firstly, if I may ask someone to give us an introduction of what is this Road to 2025 Elections, and then we'll all talk about corruption. So let's ask the political figure and counsel, Timothy Jonas, tell us a little about the Road Towards 2025 election.
I was afraid you would throw me in that pot, Doc. Okay, let me of course start with my usual objection to the description of political figure. I think everyone's holding their breath to see what happens. From the point of view of the president, who knows he only has 2 terms, I'm sure he will want his entire 5-year term to be complete before he faces an election and begins a second 5-year term, as he hopes. I think that insofar as rumors of corruption are growing and evidence of corruption is growing, and there is increasing disaffection among the rank and file of the PPP, notwithstanding the increasingly vitriolic comments of the trolls and the so-called influencers on Facebook. I think there is a sense that maybe an early elections might be politically expedient for the PPP, especially since the AFC has just got some spotlight on them because of their recent change in leadership. We know that the PNC are in disarray, and that would also encourage the PPP to an early election, hoping to take advantage of that. Whether it helps them or not, I don't know. But it seems as if we can face, probably in the first half of 2025, if the president's objections can be overcome, an early election, so that the chances of a victory during a time of apnea, disarray, and new faces in the AFC before that changes and before the AFC can get some traction with its new face. So I think that's where we're headed.
So I noticed you didn't mention Anuk, but I'll get back to that later. So constitutionally, I think the elections are not due until November of next year. Generally, as I understand it, the elections was held last year. The declaration wasn't made until August 2nd. And generally, I think you're given 3 months leeway after Parliament meets or the declaration of the elections in order to call a general election. Do I have it right, Council?
Not my area of expertise, Doc, but that's my very layman's understanding as well.
Okay, so let's hear now from GHK Lal as well. GHK, anything before we actually begin the meat section of the discussion, road towards 2025 elections? Do you have any contributions to make in addition to what Senior Counsel just did?
Well, good evening, everyone. My privilege to be here. The road to 2025 elections has got muddied. It got muddied with the arrival, the splash of the new leadership in the AFC, particularly Mr. Nigel Hughes. It got a bigger splash with the, shall I say, intervention of Mr. Alistair Routledge, Exon Mobile Guyana president, and his weighing in with no conflict of interests and so on and so forth, which I think we will be sure to touch upon to some degree. I agree with Council that the PNC is still trying to find itself, and the momentum, the spotlight is indeed on the AFC. And there's some momentum there which I think can build a groundswell and of support, at least of interest. And I think that has gotten the PPP worried. In terms of an early election, I think the PPP at least wants to ride it out to see where Donald Trump is going to end up. And I think given that assassination attempt, he holds an upper hand right now by a wider margin than I thought possible, let's say a week ago. And relative to alleged corruption, rumors of corruption and evidence of corruption, it's killing us. And I think that whereas it was a back burner issue or a negligible issue for the electorate, it is so widespread now that it has driven the entire polity to a different place.
Okay, Professor Terence Blackman, any contribution towards the road towards 2025 elections?
Well, first off, let me thank you and colleagues, GHK and Attorney Jonas and your audience for facilitating my participation in this conversation. I do think it's a very important conversation to begin to think about where Guyana goes as it relates to the election and potentially the impact of the emerging issues of corruption on that election. But I would say from a distance, I would agree with GHK Lal. I think the emergence of Nigel Hughes as the leader of the AFC has certainly injected a certain sense of, again, from a distance, a sense of optimism about the set of possibilities for what emerges as a political campaign in Guyana for the leadership and more broadly for the way in which the country is run over the next 5 years or so. I think this is perhaps going to be one of the most important elections in Guyana. And I say this because it is now clear what the stakes are. It is now clear what Guyana will be for the next 20 or 30 years. And it is now clear the opportunity that exists for Guyana as a nation, and it is also now clear that it is quite possible for us to miss this opportunity. And in this context, I think this will be an extremely contested election. As you know, as we all know here, as we move towards elections in Guyana, there's always an intensification of the ethnic and racial polarization. I think we will see much more of that. And I also think that, you know, as GHK mentioned, I think that ExxonMobil, whether folks like it or not, will be, I mean, there, you know, the way I see it, there's a sort of three-legged stool. One leg of the stool is the PPP Civic. The other leg of the stool are the combined opposition parties. And the third leg of the stool is ExxonMobil. And the question for Guyana in this moment is there going to be a kind of constructive partnership between these players, or is it going to be a war where anything goes and potentially the society itself goes? And I think that's what's facing us now. And I say that as someone who, you know, is looking from a distance, but is also deeply involved in matters related to Guyana on a whole series of fronts. So I think it is potentially the most consequential election that Guyanese will face or have faced in the history of the nation.
GHK Law, just before you spoke, mentioned a factor which you didn't, which I think we can add as the fourth factor, the fourth stool, the US elections in November. And that could very well influence whatever is a political outcome or when an election is held in Guyana as well. So just to recap, elections are not constitutional due sometime next year in Guyana, and an early election, it cannot be ruled out. Only the leadership of the PPP, I suppose, would know if and when there will be an election, whether this year or next year. And the three main parties, as Senior Counsel mentioned, the PPP, PNC, and AFC, one does not know what the planning and thinking is of the PNC leadership and the AFC leadership. The PNC says they will go on their own, the AFC says they will go on their own, and ultimately we don't know if they would. I personally don't think they will go on their own. I think there will be some kind of accommodation between those two parties and perhaps others as well. So let's hear from Senior Counsel. What does he think? What will happen next year? Senior Counsel?
That's another difficult question. You hit me with two in a row there. Okay, I think that the emergence of Nigel Hughes has transformed the point of view of the Afro-Guyanese electorate. There was a feeling of serious discontent with their own party, outrage against the excesses of the PPP, and a sense of helplessness. But Nigel has galvanized, he's seen almost as a messiah. He's galvanized the Afro voters, and justifiably so. He's competent, he's articulate, he's charismatic, he knows what he's doing. And for that reason, he's attracted a lot of positive attention from one side and a lot of attacks from the other side. This interesting attack about conflicts of interest from all the gurus who suddenly sprang up with expertise and made pronouncements is just one aspect of an attack that was made on him. I think that although Aubrey Norton clearly is resisting what to me is inevitable, which is that he will have to step aside to hand over leadership role, the presidential candidacy to Nigel, I agree with you. I think that that's inevitable at the end of the day, for the simple reason that the AFC led by Nigel Hughes will take away a lot of PNC votes if they go separately. And I don't think either of them can countenance that eventuality.
Okay, to the point where the PNC could very well end up being a minority party. And you did mention conflicts of interest and so on, and a person who has written quite a bit on conflicts of interest, the great GHK Law. You want to, what is your pronouncement for next year? And if you want to comment on conflicts of interest, or you want to come back to that point later on?
Well, let's talk about combination right now, as we've started out with that. Opposition leader, PNC leader Aubrey Norton came away with 97.6% of the votes cast for leadership, 1041 out of 1066. Don't ask me how they got to that number. Must be something in the eligibility criteria, out of 2,000 or 1,300. Be that as it may, he got 97.6%. And since then, he has virtually been somewhat inaudible, if not invisible. He's a busy man, and he's known to be an organizer par excellence, so he could be on the ground and so on and so forth. But I thought that with such a broad-based and overwhelming show of support from the delegates level, that he would have been out there. And one of the first things he said, that resolution really empowered him about presidential candidate, solely that he would be the determining, and it must, and he said it, really we are the major party and it must come from the PNC. Now, Nigel Hughes, when the question about to coalesce or not to coalesce came out, he said, right now our priority is to build the party. And I hear him. I think he certainly has that right. But how long he's going to be, as a practical matter, gentlemen, look, and our audience knows this. We know the reality of our electoral demographics, our electoral culture. Dr. Blackman, Professor Blackman, spoke about it in terms of his reference in his introductory remarks to ethnic and racial tensions or racial ideas and reviews that sort of spiral during elections season. And so I think some of that is going to be present, but practically neither of the opposition party can prevail, no matter, it's got to be something close to a miracle will prevail against the PPP juggernaut, and especially given the numbers that favor it. Look. There's lots of disgruntled people within the PPP camp. In Nigel Hughes's arrival, his anointment, so to speak, and the fevered reaction to his presence from the PPP side tells me that they're not too bothered about conflict of interest. This is really about the recognition of a major political threat. And so that is why you have all this noise about how Exon could have arrived at this, and suddenly experts, to use counsel's word, experts on conflict of interest. Look, let's cut to the chase here. This is about a major political threat. But having said that, I think there have to be some meeting of the minds between the AFC and the PNC, and it ain't Aubrey Norton. It is not Aubrey Norton who really is going to be that game swinger for the possibility, the probability. Let's reduce this to mathematics, Dr. Blackman's forte. The probability of the combined opposition prevailing. I think with Nigel Hughes, there may, I'm hedging here, a slight chance to come out ahead here. And so a combination, coalition, some permutation is going to have to happen between now and sometime next year. I don't think the elections are going to happen this year, although it could be advantageous to the People's Progressive Party. But if it happens early mid next year, that coalition in whatever form between the AFC and PNC has to be. In terms of conflict of interest,
can we come back to that later?
Yes, we should.
Yes,
we should move on.
Yeah, let's hear from the professor of what he feels about coalition, this permutation that GHK talked about, or whether there'll be any alignment or realignment of forces or voting in Guyana.
So I think we're sitting in a very interesting place. The PPPC has traditionally and will draw their support from Indo-Guyanese. APNU, AFC, the PNC, PNCR, they have traditionally drawn their support, and they will continue. This is our historical reality. When the people get closer to the voting booth, this is what happens. We can go back and look through all of our elections, and you just mentioned the probabilities. This is what happens. I really think in this context, that organizations like the Alliance for Change and ANUG that is represented here, I think that from a political ideological perspective, they are aiming at this kind of centrist progressive agenda, right? National unity, good governance, anti-corruption, sustainable economic development, and they're seeking to transcend the ethnic divisions and appeal broad section of Guyanese across these regions. And it's not as if we have not seen that this has not had some success. The fact that the PPPC was defeated in 2015 was in large part due to the actual votes, certainly the symbolic appeal of the AFC as part of that coalition. So I think the challenge, and this is where I maybe differ just a little. I think the challenge for AFC, given how things ended, is to avoid at this moment falling directly back into this coalition immediately. I think this tension is there for the AFC. They can't tomorrow be a part of a new coalition in where the rules are not clear. So I think they want to hold out for as long as possible as an independent voice, as a voice that really seeks in a very serious way to eschew the kind of racial paradigm. Whether they're going to be able to garner a significant fraction of votes is a legitimate question, but I think their strength lies in the fact that people are once again seeing them as potentially an institution that can bridge the divide and be a center, a stable, a mature political actor, and not sort of devolving to one side of the fence or another, and to really begin to think about Guyana in a long-term sense. So I would if I were to offer advice to the AFC, I would say, hold your fire for a moment. This is not going to be decided tomorrow. Don't immediately go into a fixed coalition, because it's not immediately clear that benefits you and that benefits the broad opposition in at this moment. On the other side, I think for the PPP, if I were to offer them some advice, I think that what they need to be thinking about is, look, they have, rightly focused on matters of infrastructure, focused on matters of, we're building hospitals, we're trying to strengthen our education system, and they've listed a number. But what is still clear is that there's still significant discontent with the broad sort of governance of the PPP, the questions of corruption, etc., that are undermining institutions that we've discussed in the past. So I think for the PPP that there's a moment here too for a genuine move to the center, and to not govern with this kind of really heavy hand. There's a moment here to engage the center and to move beyond the kind of, well, we're seeking, Afro-Guyanese votes, but it's an Afro-Guyanese vote seeking that is not based on sort of a broad sort of agreement with an ideological position, but it is based in a sense with, look, I'll do better for you. I'll fix you economically. It's not based on saying, here is the vision we have for Guyana, and here's how you fit into that. And I think that that's the strength that the AFC has at this moment, and it shouldn't give that strength away. And similarly, I think whether we like it or not, the PNC is a party that historically Afro-Guyanese will vote for the PNC. And, the last election, I think the difference between the counts was about 5,000 votes. And so that is not an insignificant number. And a number of their constituents were disaffected at that moment. So I think that the opportunity for them to do work with their constituents, and maybe I would suppose maybe that is what Mr. Norton is doing. He's probably thinking, I don't need to have a big rally. What I need to do is to build my ground game, because my people will vote for me, as we saw in the local government elections, when everyone thought there'd be a complete wipeout, and then there wasn't. And so he understands the historical reality is that Afro-Guyanese will vote for the PNC in significant numbers, and the vote differences between these two parties are not that huge. And so the opportunity to rebuild the base is, I think, the thing that, if I were giving some advice to the PNC, that's what I would do. But again, I would also say rebuild the base and move to the center. We're too far out on the extremes. Move to the center, have a less confrontational, have a stronger ideological battle with the People's Progressive Party, and less a personal battle with the various figures in the People's Progressive Party, and more an idea like, what is your vision for Guyana? How do you fit into this vision that I have for Guyana? And I think that's the advice that I would offer.
I don't know how much draw Aubrey Norton has among the traditional base of the party. In fact, he has been extremely unpopular. But as you rightly pointed out, in the local election, the PNC was still able to
I think it would be a mistake. I think
to hold on to its base. Yeah.
Look at all of our elections.
But
we see where vote counts ended up. So I would not discount Mr. Aubrey Norton and his chances for success in an election, because I think there are a large number of people who perhaps were not as enamored with the previous leadership, did not go out to vote in the kind of numbers that were necessary, felt that they were not getting what they had signed up for. But I don't think that those people are going to wake up tomorrow and go someplace else. The only other place they might go is to the AFC. But, I think history says that they don't go there. And so I think the PNC is not in spite of all of the internal leadership battles and some of the dysfunction and so on that has emerged in the past, I think that their position is not as structurally not as untenable as we might think it.
One cannot discount the fact that the PPP has been wooing the African base, the PNC traditional base, and also the indigenous people with some success, especially among the Amerindians. Would you agree, Council, from your analysis, observation?
I find it interesting that we continue to my mind, conflate some issues after we start out from a premise that is unshakable. The premise is unshakable. It's PNC votes black and PPP votes Indian. Let's start with that. Not a person in Guyana can disagree with that. For some reason, we then segue into a discussion about whether it makes sense for Aubrey Norton to do some grassroots work. It doesn't matter if it's Aubrey Norton or Daffy Duck or Mickey Mouse. Afro-Guyanese will vote PNC. He could do grassroots work, he could stay home. When election time comes, Afro-Guyanese will vote PNC. And it doesn't matter if Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny is the candidate for PPP. When election time comes, Indo-Guyanese will vote PPP. And if you put it the other way, conversely, if Barrett Jagdeo makes a shock announcement tomorrow that he is leaving the PPP and going over to the PNC, he will take one vote with him. If you doubt me, think Moses Nagamutu. And conversely, if Norton says he's leaving APNU and has a ministerial appointment in the PPP, he will take one vote with him. Two, he's married. He may take two votes with him. That's the only difference. The voting loyalty has nothing to do with the individuals. The irony is they have no personal power. What happens is that the believers try to hold them up to justify an irrational, I'm sorry, that's not fair, it's very rational. History in Guyana shows us it's rational. A rational need to ensure that the party that ethnically looks like you is in power. It doesn't matter who's in charge. So they will complain, as you say, they will grumble, they will be discontent, and they will still put their finger and vote for their party. Now, in that case, and if that's true, all discussions about whether Norton is charismatic, whether he's seen as working at the grassroots level, irrelevant. What I will agree with, and this is what Terence has been talking about, and I agree with this from one side point of view, is that if the perception is that the leadership in the PNC is moderate, is liberal, is easygoing, then the traditional caution that the PPP supporter has may possibly be dispelled and you may get some crossover votes. So whereas Burnham carried that fear and stigma of electoral fraud, Granger was seen as a moderate and may have swayed some crossovers, may have lulled them into a sense of security, although then he showed his true colors. I think that from his history and his demeanor, Aubrey Norton is not seen as a moderate. He is seen as more of a hardliner. And this is where there's an interesting lack of self-awareness in the PNC camp. Because after Granger's failure, the response in the camp was, Granger was too weak, we need a strong leader. But strong leader translates away from the moderate, liberal, middle-class, charismatic person that may lull a crossover vote into that hardliner that will ensure that the traditional PPP vote is not going to cross over. So there needs to be that self-awareness that the person at the head of PNC needs to be, he needs to have this demeanor, middle class, urban, educated, soft-spoken, smiling, non-threatening. Now, Nigel has those qualities. And if Norton runs as the presidential candidate, in my view, the crossover votes will not be lulled. Now, it's also a simplification to think that automatically the crossover votes will be lulled if Nigel becomes the presidential candidate. That is something I can't anticipate, I can't predict. I do know, and I want to remind you of this, that you pointed out the difference between the two parties 2011, 2015, 2020. was about 5,000 to 10,000 votes. It was minuscule, tiny. But for me, what was important is that in 2020, which was a critical time, because 2020 was the culmination of a triumphant removal of the PPP who had been in there for such a long time, and then, be careful what you pray for, 5 years of PNC. So it was a situation where the PNC was at low ebb, PPP was at high ebb because we'd had 5 years of poor governance from the PNC, perceived poor governance. And yet the difference in vote was still 5,000. And at that time, 10,000 people voted for neither of those two parties, voted for third parties. I think that's important. And those 10,000 people had previously found a home. Those are the crossover votes who had previously found a home with AFC and had been lulled into apathy. Because I promise you, there is no PPP voter, nobody who voted PPP in 2015 that said in 2020, man, I'm going to vote for a third party. Not one. But there are many people, and I count 10,000 of them, who voted AFC APNU in 2015. And I said, no, not good enough, and went to vote for a third party in 2020.
Okay, so before we have GHK to respond or to add to those remarks, he was beginning to talk about conflicts of interest. So I was just wondering, as a counsel, can you explain that term for us? I mean, for the not so sophisticated like me.
You know, it's interesting they say be careful what you pray for.
And you know, there are different types of conflicts of interest. So let's deal in terms of Nigel Hughes. I mean, as a counsel, as a lawyer, what's a conflict of interest from the legal perspective of a lawyer?
Well, let me give you an example that comes to mind for me, that Guyanese, accustomed to our oppression, have actually given labels to. They've identified and they've given it a label that every Guyanese recognize. The word Prado. Now, if a government controls central housing and planning, because it appoints the board of central housing and planning, and influences that board which it controls to find and allocate prime real estate and issue it by passing normal channels as house lots to government ministers and government preferences. That is a conflict of interest. And I'm sure the gurus will hear me and understand. And Guyanese, accustomed to our oppression, identified one such area and called it Pradoville, where central housing and planning, controlled by the government, issued house lots to specific people, and what I feel was a conflict in many of those cases. Not all, but in many of those cases. Now, the reason that the label Pradoville came about arises from another conflict of interest, where people in Parliament who pass laws to impose on me and GHK Lal tax obligations use the power that they have in Parliament to exempt themselves from those same tax obligations in such a crass and vulgar way that nearly every Land Cruiser Prado that you see driving on the road is a duty-free Land Cruiser Prado, to the extent that the poor oppressed Guyanese link the Prado to government ministers and government officials and friends and family, because none of them are duty. If one of them or two of them are duty paid, that's a lot. More than 99% of them are duty free. They're not a tax earner, they're not a revenue earner. That is a conflict when the people with the power to make the laws exempt themselves from their own laws. So you have Prados being driven around duty free, and you have Pradoville created as a result of that. I'd like to point out those two conflicts of interest. I suspect that that's clear enough for anybody.
And in terms of the council, Nigel Hughes?
Well, he's not in a position of power, is he? So he hasn't passed laws. He hasn't directed a board or a government agency or a statutory body to do something. A lawyer can act in a conflict, but the circumstances, Nigel will know the details. I am not going to pronounce on them because the facts and the circumstances turn and are different depending on those variables. But I can tell you as a lawyer that I can act for Terrence Blackman in litigation in a matter today, and I can sue Terrence Blackman in litigation tomorrow once the two matters are unconnected. So don't cry wolf too quickly. Wait to see what the facts are.
So if I, as a counsel, am representing the buyer and the seller, that is a potential conflict, not a potential, it is a conflict of interest.
It's potentially because the buyer and seller may have come to you and have said, I'm buying this car for $20. Please do the agreement.
Okay.
You do the agreement selling the car for $20, they sign and they go their way.
Okay.
So it turns on a great number of variables. It's why I'm trying to encourage everyone not to adopt a hard and fast four corners where you're not exercising power or dominion over a statutory body or over an agency that has statutory power. Where you are an agent yourself, you can act in conflict, but the variables are too many for any of us to be able to, on the outside, make a pronouncement. And I decline to make a pronouncement in Nigel's case.
So GHK, sir, you have written quite a bit on conflicts of interest. So you want to address that issue?
Well, before we go there, I think I want to add a few words to counsel and professors' thoughts about voting.
Okay.
We'll come to that. I think that I hear counsel talking about the traditional votes, and I think my word for that would be the diehards. You're not going to get them. You're not going to forget about cross and movement. They're stuck where they are in PNC and PPP land. I heard you say about 10,000. I didn't hear you say about Venezuelans. And that number is already a subject of concern, and I think it's going to grow into a subject of controversy as we grow closer and closer to whatever that date is. But given the level of corruption which is down the road here for us tonight, there is that sense in me that there are what I call low-hanging fruit that of voters that I agree with you that I do not think that Mr. Norton has done the work or that he will be able to attract. However, Nigel Hughes has you listed the attributes to be that catalyst, that magnet that draws them. There are people here that are truly upset, discontented with where things are, and they are in the PPP's camp. And I think whether there are so many thousands, the base will remain the base in both parties. However, that's where I think that's where the elections could revolve. Plus this question about the type of voting and how that's going to be processed, and the Venezuelan vote. Nigel Hughes has what it takes to, I think, attract those crossover, low-hanging fruit, whatever you want to call them. Now, the AFC had lost some footing when it went with the PNC and so on and so forth. I get the sense, being here for the first time since this reborn AFC has come about. And I get the sense that voters, those mugwumps, fence sitters, their rump is on one side and their mug is on the other side, they are ready for the cultivating. They are ready for the cultivating, and it hinges on poor governance, corruption, cult leadership, and so on and so forth. And I think that's where the AFC has an opportunity to be a game changer. So there's a confluence of things going on here. As to how much Exon is going to be involved in our elections, that is up in the air, but I think it's not going to be on the sidelines. It may be invisible, but it certainly is going to be palpable in terms of money. And that counts for a lot in this country, well, in any elections for that matter. Conflict of interests. Nigel Hughes does not have a conflict of interest today. Let me make that clear. So, Council, you and I, and I'm sure Professor will have his moment with this, he does not have a conflict of interest today. The fact is he has a professional legal relation, I think I was surprised to find this out, of some 20 years standing. It's not now, it's not since we found oil. I think he said on some program that this relationship with Exxon has been around for about 20 years. Now, that's a pretty long time in a professional setup. He has said what he plans to do. When he crosses, if he were to cross that threshold into the seat of office, the corridors of power, and the biggest thing being oil and gas. Well, his oil and gas committee is going to have to, as I've asserted publicly, is going to have to report to someone. He cannot, at that time, and only at that time, is he going to have that real conflict of interest that would be of a concern to me, and I think to the electorate. Having said that, Dr. Bisram and gentlemen and to our audience, I think it is in the interests of Nigel Hughes to say right now, to stand up and raise his hand and differentiate himself from the PPP and the PNC by saying, you know what, I am going to make this sacrifice. It's going to be a very, very expensive one, because we're talking about, I don't know, millions of US dollars annually, probably. And I'm going to put that aside, because the representation of the Guyanese people and the vision that I have for this society trumps, for want of a better word, aces everything else, including my professional relationship, including indeed my work to some extent, because I want to fully focus. I don't want to be dragged down by these distractions. I do not want to be diminished by what is seen, perceived, misread, misinterpreted as a conflict of interest today when such does not exist. I do not think that there is a higher ground that Mr. C.A. Nigel Hughes can take today than that one. As to how many, I think the crossover votes, all of them, will be his. Will be his. I have stood up in a crucible of test, and I've answered, and I've responded in the only way that a man of standards, a man of principle, a man of some value, a man of some patriotism. You cannot talk to me about patriotism anymore. You cannot talk to me about old wineskins and new wineskins. And if the scriptural analogy is too unfamiliar with people, you can't tell me that I have not done what it takes and delivered when it was demanded of me. And before it is demanded of me, I am going to step forward and make that sacrifice. It's more than a symbolism. It is what is real. He does not have a conflict of interest today, but by stepping forward and saying, let's get this off the table. Let's not have a discussion, one more word about conflict of interest. And I think that could count for a lot.
Even though an election may be over a year away.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Professor, your response or comments on what the two other gentlemen stated?
Yeah, I actually thought Timothy Jonas would have said what GHK Lau just said. He kind of took a very legal position and not a political position. Look,
Well, that's
Nigel
why he's
Hughes
a
is a
lawyer.
prominent lawyer. Nigel Hughes is a prominent lawyer, right? He's well known for his legal expertise. You know, most recently we saw him and we saw one of the, you know, the folks from one of the officials of the PPP who, having found himself in trouble, sought the best legal representation that he could seek, and he thought that Nigel Hughes was the person that he should take. So I think this is the first thing that we ought to underline, that Nigel Hughes is an excellent lawyer. ExxonMobil, on the other hand, is a major multinational oil and gas corporation, right? And it is the developer of the Stabroek Block. It's heavily involved in matters of Guyana. So if Nigel Hughes is representing Exxon in legal matters, you know, GHK is right. There could be a perceived conflict of interest. I think Nigel Hughes should more than most would recognize that, especially if he will hold a public office or a political position, a leader of a political party that that could ultimately influence the regulatory decisions or public policy related to the oil and gas industry. So there, we shouldn't. That's there, right? So my sense is that, and in a real sense, I mean, when you see that any involvement that Nigel has in shaping, influencing the regulatory framework for the oil and gas industry could be perceived, rightly or wrongly, but in this business, it's a business of perception. It could be perceived as a conflict, right? If he's simultaneously representing the major industry player, right? It's not so. I want to say that very clearly. And then there's also this question, which I think GHK alluded to, which is kind of like Guyana is such a society of low trust. And so this sort of public trust in the kind of legal and political institutions, they're going to be eroded, right? Because if there's Attorney General Timothy sort of focused on, the Central Housing and Planning Authority has a board. The board is appointed by folks in the government, and they influence the board to find prime real estate, which they sell to these people bypassing some process. This is the public trust, and so you in a way have eroded the public trust. I think where Nigel's done a really good job is to sort of say he's been transparent. Look, my role with these guys is transparent. These are clients of my firm. I don't handle the majority of the cases. There's another lawyer who handles this, and I'm not. And there are some clear boundaries between the legal work that is being done by my firm. But I think you asked at the beginning, and I said that this would be one of the will be the most consequential election for Guyana. And I think that Hughes represents a kind of candidate that potentially could have this center, could really galvanize the center. So it would do the politics from the center out rather than from the extremes in. And so I was sort of thinking that, if I were to offer any guidance in this, I would say that he's got to figure out how to make sure there are clear boundaries that address these concerns that go to maintaining trust in the public around what my potential role. And you can see, I initially, when I saw the constant sort of attacks in this regard, I thought, that it would I thought it was the card that perhaps was the strongest card, and I was surprised that they somehow went to the strongest card first. But it is in real sense a strong card, and because it goes to, if you say that at this moment I've put Guyana first, and then in the second moment say, but I have this client, and I'm not here saying what decisions I would make. I'm just offering an analysis. Right? I have this client. This client is the one with whom many of the issues in Guyana revolve, and I will be the potential. I'm aspiring to be the job that regulates this client. Then I think you have to somehow find that moral clarity to say, and you can't recuse yourself. I think this is the problem. It's not like Donald Trump having a business and then saying, look, I'm going to put this in a blind trust, and so I won't have any access to it, in a sense, because it's immediately there. If you're the president of Guyana, the single most important economic thing that you have to do is to manage the relationship with this behemoth, and so that definitely seems to me to be something that has to be resolved. And I would naively say that this is where he has to say, for a moment, I haven't thought through what it should be said, but I kind of come down along the lines like GHK and saying, you have to say, look, in this moment, I put Guyana first, and whenever there is an opportunity, there's never going to be an opportunity where you will have some doubt about whether or not I'm negotiating on behalf of Guyana in the best faith. I'm not negotiating for both the buyer and the seller here. I think that's, from a layman's perspective, it's something that you have to, Hughes and the folks in the AFC have to be mindful of. I think they should not elide that easily. And they should not lawyer it up like Timothy Jonas just lawyered it up. Say, wait for the facts, all the facts. I mean, you're the head of the third most important political party in Guyana. That's a fact. That party will have a manifesto that speaks to its relationship with the oil and gas industry. That's a fact.
Let's hear from GHK, and then I want to ask Timothy something about alleged corruption. Go ahead, GHK.
Yeah. It's interesting that Exon came out through Mr. Routledge and said, this is where we stand with conflict of interest. I'd have thought that given the lawyer-client relationship, that would be a matter to be discussed privately, and says, look, we have an objection or we have no objection to this. I am intrigued by ExxonMobil, president in Guyana, that Mr. Routledge comes out publicly and says, this is where we stand, we see no conflict. And here is a counsel of 20 years duration who's got to know, I would think, as a matter of routine, all the facts and figures and circumstances and underlying situations, elements, components of your presence in Guyana. And this man is running for president. And this man has just raised his hand. And so he's got a wealth of information in his files about you, and knowledge in his head, and some sense of how you operate. And still there is no hesitancy, and there's no concern, so to speak, at least publicly, about what could be detrimental to my interests as an Exxon executive, as an Exxon's presence and leading presence in this country. So I'm asking myself, in terms of conflict of interest, what other components are there on the Exxon side in favor of Nigel Hughes in this matter that has come up? And the last point I want, before I hand back to you, make is that when I see a political master, and I have to give him that, a political master, you can call him what you want, political animal, political creature, the instinct of Vice President, former President Bharat Jagdeo to almost jump out of bed and in his pajamas within an hour or thereabouts to say, hey, what is going on here? How you don't have a problem with conflict of interest? I mean, the reaction was almost instantaneous. And I said to myself, hey, what has galvanized this guy into action and on the wrong side of Exxon? I have never heard him say a boo against Exxon. Or, Mr. Routledge, I think I beg to differ here, sir. I think you've got that wrong. I've never heard him say anything about it. But on conflict of interest, and none with Nigel Hughes and his relationship and his running, here is Vice President and Chief Policymaker Bharat Jagdeo up in arms and in our faces, well, in Exxon's face, so to speak. That tells me there is more to this than meets the eye. Before I go to Mr. Timothy Jonas, I want to congratulate him on his familiarity with Warner Brothers cartoons. I forgot to mention that earlier. Over to you, Dr. Mitra.
So Professor Blackman alluded to trust and confidence, and it's a nice transition to talk about allegations of corruption. So historically in Guyana and virtually every country, governments always say or said, what corruption? Where is the evidence? So can you address that alleged corruption in Guyana? Council.
Well, I think before I go there, I'd like to respond briefly to this whole distinction between a conflict and a perception, or some public perception, some real or imagined or conjured public perception. You see, I just heard GHK speculate to an enormous extent about what knowledge a lawyer may or may not have about the internal workings, internal operations of his client, especially a large corporate client. And his speculations, and this is speculations from a highly intelligent man, went much, much further than I think any lawyer realistically will say to you he has any knowledge like that at all of his corporate client. The fact is that at present, Nigel has no say in terms of creating regulations, changing regulations, issuing regulation. And the fact also is that at present, nobody knows how integrally involved he is with his client. But I can tell you that Exxon can come and say, man, I'm buying a piece of land, do the transport for me. Where's the conflict there with some kind of regulatory organization and how you get in offshore oil arrangements? You know, there are simple transactions, easy transactions, difficult transactions. You simply don't know. But more than that, it is tremendously unfair. And this is experience speaking. When you recognize the harm in the two big parties, so you stick your neck out, you stick your hand out, you stick your wallet out, and you decide to make an effort to find a home for the people who are like-minded and recognize the harm in the two parties. You don't make any friends. There's this easy whitewash that the public likes to do, and again, public perception and the naive and happy baying of the loyalists that politicians are self-interested and in it for money and in it for this and in it for that. You get no benefit from taking a third-party route in Guyana. You lose the benefit from the Indo population who are supporting PPP. You lose the benefit from the Afro population who are supporting the PNC. Where is the benefit? So you're looking at Nigel, who says he's going to take a run with the AFC. And you say to this man who's taking his neck out, who is distancing himself from the two parties, you're saying to him, he must give up his best client because there's some public perception, which at this stage is probably total nonsense, that because the loyalists and the party supporters and the party henchmen are crying foul and crying wolf, because of this perception, this totally conjured perception, to change the perception, you gotta cut off your own nose, knowing that you're not making any friends anyway, because both sides vex with you. You're asking a lot there.
Yeah.
You're asking a huge amount there. Because let me tell you, if he runs independently in next year, he's not gonna be president. He's not gonna win. So what are we really asking of people who are willing to throw their hat in the ring and say, man, I have an idea. Let's see if we could give it a shot. Before you even want to give them eligibility, are you suggesting to the public that it is better for them to stay with APNU, stay with PPP, rather than listen to this man who's thrown his hat in the ring, having recognized the harm in both APNU and PPP over the last 60 years in our country? We border on the ridiculous when we go there. Now, you asked about corruption. I never yet see a thief man who plans his robbery hoping that you'll find out about it. You plan your robbery hoping that you won't get caught. And if you're clever, you succeed and you hide all the evidence, or you do not allow evidence to be created so you won't get caught. So when the loyalists show me the evidence, it's as if they're trumpeting the success of those folk that they're loyal towards, that their skill and expertise in this stealing is so great that they have not left any evidence. I think that's a bit silly. That show me the evidence thing is self-defeating. But there's no smoke without fire. And we are seeing smoke. We are seeing enormous buildings going up. We are seeing serious signs of serious wealth. We are hearing about unexplained wealth, the only police being foreigners. And we are seeing the awards of licenses, in petroleum import licenses, cambio licenses, gold licenses, building licenses, awards of contract. We are seeing all of these things. And then we're hearing that when a contract is awarded, the governing body refuses to answer the Public Procurement Commission or to answer questions as to how it was done or to explain how this pre-qualification necessity was bypassed and ignored. And we look at the legislation and see there are no penalties. There's no sanctions for breaching. We see windows and gaps in the legislative structure that allow you to bypass. The smoke is there. So yeah, I don't have proof, but the same people I would say, well, you prove to me, sitting where you are, that Mingo used the bed sheet.
Can I respond to?
Okay, and then we'll go to GHK. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think Timothy makes an important point about this question of perceived and real conflict of interest, but it goes to the heart, I think, of the conversation that we're having, and whether you see there's a moment here where and we kind of bantered around this in the pre-show. There is a moment here where I think the leadership of Guyana, the leadership class of Guyana, has to take serious stock, and they have to say that Guyana is important, that Guyana as a country is important, that it is the most important thing. And if Guyana survives, then they and their children will survive. And they might survive independently outside of Guyana, but their and their children won't grow up and reap the legacy of the folks who helped to build this country. And I think that that's the decision that is going to face Aubrey Norton. That is the decision that is going to face Irfan Ali, and that is the decision that faces Nigel Hughes. And I will say this: you cannot, and I say it unequivocally, you cannot simply say, you know what, I want the highest, I aspire to lead this great country. I think I want to take us to a place where we have, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week electricity. We will do big things in education. We will do big things in healthcare. We will do big things in the legal institutions. We will do big things. And then say in the next breath, you know what, but, I don't have friends on one side. I don't have friends, and I'm sticking my head out, and therefore you can't do that. And I think it's important for us to understand that this is the moment where you can't do that. You can't aspire to the biggest office and then say, but I only want to do it halfway. You got to be, at this moment, you got to be able to say, you know what, I will take a leave of absence from my office. So you can be sure that I am not going to be influenced in a particular way by what happens here. But I think this is the moment. We've had these elections over and over again. They've not led to any resolution. There's an opportunity for a resolution, and I think that this is the moment where our leadership has got to lead, and they have to take the mature leadership position. They have to show that they're willing to put the society first, and each one of those people who aspire to those positions have to do that, and they can't do it in that way where they say, there's some personal hits that I'm going to take, and therefore it's not going to be the. I can't level with you. I can't be transparent with you. I can't, because then it leads us to the same place. So I wanted to say that because I think that that's important. This question of, what does the leadership do? And I think it's important to say that, because that will be, mark my words, that will be the significant criticism, and it will find resonance. It will find resonance among lots of people that, you're willing to be the leader, but, you're unwilling to make the sacrifices on behalf of the group. If you think the group is important, you have to be able to make, and I think we have people who make the sacrifices for the little tribes. Some people are making the sacrifice to the Afro tribe. Some people are making the sacrifices for the Indo tribe, but no one is stepping up and saying, I'm going to make the sacrifice for the Afro tribe, the Indo tribe, the indigenous tribe, and all the tribes that make up this thing. And so I think that's very important. I don't think we should elide that point. I don't think we, the folks who put their hat in the ring have to think that through if they want to take us to a different place in 2025, or we will stay with the same kind of 50.1, 49.9, and continue to quibble.
GHK, allegations of corruption. We don't have much time left, so.
Was that a corrupt practice there just now? We don't have much time left?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for reminding me about that. Corruption was sort of a nonchalant issue for the Guyanese electorate, holding aside for a moment ethnic voting patterns. But corruption has become so pervasive. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, my fellow Guyanese, I'm speaking to you. And I know this is a diaspora-based audience for the most part. You cannot believe the level of corruption that exists in this country today. Council and I live here. I'm a remigrant. 10 years ago, I wrote a book, Guyana, a National Cesspool of Corruption, Deception, and Something Else. I should be a prophet. That was my personal experience in different government offices. Personal experience as a brand new remigrant. All of the copies sold out. I didn't put it on Amazon. But here's why I mentioned that. What has happened then is chicken feed stuff versus what is happening today. OFAC. You want evidence? Take out the allegation. Corruption network is the caption. In our faces. Nobody could point that at me. I am not a part of that, gentlemen, and people who are listening here. But a corruption network is a system, a sprawling system that could be 2 or 2,000 or 200,000. 2 million if this country had it. That number of people. A network, corruption network, the U.S. Department of Treasury, OFAC. And they name names. Well, they had a phone. And we come down here and they speak three times in that release, identifying the three names. And the 3 times they mention 2 words, government officials, government officials, government officials. Old officials, PNC, APNU, whatever, old PPP, which is new PPP, today's PPP, government officials, bureaucrats alone, meaning public servants, gentlemen, ladies listening, or political officers, government officials. I think it is a combination of the two. The political officers, although the public servants are much more numerous, the political officers in terms of the muscle power, the horsepower, the influencing power that they bring into this corruption milieu is unimaginable. You walk in this country and you are liable to those in the diaspora to stumble and fall on your face in corruption, not of your doing. So when the people talk about that, you look at and Council Jonas alluded to that, the National Attender Board, the evaluation committees, the Public Procurement Commission, the watchdog. So who is the dog watching when the people there go to a point and say, after a 6-month delay, well, A and B and C were violated, and they don't have the nuts or the cojones to say, hey, listen, I heard about penalties as identified in the law, and say, well, look, let's fire some people. Let's give them their due process and then get rid of them. Send them off quietly or with some bell ringing attached to their head. How long are we going to continue like this? OFAC spoke about it. There's your evidence, and that is the tip of the iceberg. That's the tip of the iceberg. That is a contributing factor, I think, in this election, like no other election, because it is so rampant, so widespread, and we are so knee deep in it. Corruption is not a priceless practice. It has its victims. It has its victims. It's not a bloodless undertaking, because the $666.2 billion out of a $1.146 trillion budget, $1,146 billion, that's 58%. You put that in America, you put that in some country that has standards and watchdogs and policies and procedures and ethical people. And you know what? You're going to have some Judases in that mix. They are going to tamper with that. You come to a third world country like Guyana, and you're going to tell me about produce the evidence? You just insulted me. You just degraded yourself because you show what kind of moral code you operate by. I'm not asking you to go on witch hunts. I mean, they certainly looked for me, hunted for me, and they didn't find the witch. They found somebody they never want to deal with. And to Council's point, you are an independent commentator in this country. You are going to get crushed by the two pincers, PNC and PPP. You have to pick a side. Somebody told me that, a university professor here, I think he's a friend of yours, Professor Blackman, and he says, if you don't pick a side in this country, you are going to get crushed, my boy. Well, I'm still around, so
from both sides.
From both sides. So here I am. So that's part of the corruption. It's not about corrupt practices alone. It's a corruption of values. It's a corruption of standards. It's a corruption of ethics. It's a corruption of truth. And it's a corruption of character. Now, when we can't speak about it, Bamia School, pump station, $2.1 billion wharf. Good Lord, who is involved in that? Whose money is in there? How do the bidder, the lowest bidder that lost, didn't have the wherewithal to say, hey, listen, I have been the victim of an injustice there, so I'm lodging a complaint. What does it take Karaya and Karaya, who is not the lowest bidder, to say, hey, you know what? If I never get another government contract again, to hell with it. I am lodging a complaint. And that was what was done. Or else these things just go on. So OFAC touched the thing. I think the Americans have just started. If you notice, almost weekly, somebody, and we're not talking about social media here. I am not on social media, so I don't know. I get these little drips and drabs. Somebody's detained in is escorted or detained in your neck of the woods, Professor Blackman and Dr. Bisram. What is going on there? If I go there, I'm sure I'm going to sail through, because nobody's got anything on me, and I can say that with some degree of pride. Here's this. The corruption is so thick that even the Yanks are concerned about it, because you know what? That thing is 120 miles offshore from here. But all the supporting, the ancillary service, the downstream, is on land. And yes, you've got a favorable investment climate, the financial aspect of it, the contractual aspect of it. But here's this. You better have the peace and stability on the ground. And I don't know how long you're going to tell half of the electorate, or close to half of it, that, hey, listen, you stay there and we're going to come for you, and we're going to give you what we believe that you should get at this point. I think the Americans are concerned about that. They have assets here. That's where the ascendancy of Nigel Hughes has a lot of cylinders going for it. I think that corruption will be a contributory factor, and it's not minimal in the 2025 election. I'm kind of fusing these things here together. The corruption is real. The corruption is plentiful. And the corruption is killing us, and it's choking us now. And you asked for evidence, Dr. Bisram, and I'm just picking you. And then the Americans come here and say, you want here, take this. And they stuff that thing down our throats, and we are left like, what happened to us here? A horse just kicked us. It's not that we didn't see some of it coming, right? And I know some of these people here that were named. And let me say this to you, alleged. They've got to defend themselves. Here's the thing here. Somebody's got to have to make a stand for this. And I notice Nigel has pointed his finger at that. We're going to have governance and whatever else. Good. Somebody's going to have to live up to it, because we can't continue with this. We are losing money, we are losing reputation, and we're just losing our sanity.
Let's give the professor a couple of minutes, or 1 minute to. You have any remarks, comments on alleged allegations of corruption in Guyana?
No, I think we've addressed this. I mean, it's okay. It's clear. I mean, we just mentioned the most, the recent incident of the Minister of Natural Resources being, visiting his father in the hospital and having interactions with federal officials. I mean, someone carrying a diplomatic should, or who ought to be carrying a diplomatic passport, should not be having that kind of interaction. So I mean, I think we would stick our head in the sand to say that we're unaware of the increasing corrupt quality of some aspects of the society, of many aspects of the society. I've just mentioned a few of them. So actually, what I wanted to say, it's interesting. This program has kind of revolved around somehow the AFC. It's kind of become the wild card in the thing, and I really perhaps it's really where it in a sense the road to the 2025 elections. That's the point I will make. Goes through the AFC.
Thank you.
I think the AFC was instrumental in breaking the long-standing dominance of the PPP, leading to the historic change of government 2015. And I think that the AFC has the ability to influence national politics in a significant manner, and I think that the leadership of Nigel Hughes is really key to that. And I think how that unfolds now, I can't speak to some of the local issues. I can only say how I see it from a distance. But I think that the challenge and this will be the challenge for everyone there, which is somehow for the AFC in particular, balancing this kind of centrist place while finding ways to align with other members of the coalition. Right? They were eliminated because people felt that they went away from this centrist position and were co-opted in some sense. And I think that is the challenge. They hold the key for the 2025 election. So that's all I will say on that.
Well, thank you for bringing us back to the focus of the discussion tonight. Any final word, Senior Counsel, before we close?
Certainly, and I'm glad that Terence brought us back there. And let me say this is one of the few occasions I'm going to disagree with him, and I'll tell you why. We talked about the numbers game, and we talked about the swing voter, and we talked about the fact that the base on either side are unshakable and unmovable. But what I think we're not recognizing is that swing vote, those 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 voters who are willing to think before they vote, they're the sophisticated ones. They're the ones who are educated, who are professional, who've risen above this blind ethnic loyalty, who've rejected the ethnic alliance and the racism. And they're the smart ones. Now, the AFC has to overcome a hurdle. The hurdle is that it was silent in 2020, and many of its members who remain in leadership now actively participated in what happened in 2020. So when you talk about a swing voter, you're talking about me. And when I see a lot of the personnel there, I continue to have reservations. So speaking for myself, I see the AFC as eroding the PNC base because of the charisma and the ability of its new leader, Nigel. But insofar as the commentators are saying it's a possibility that it will be attracting the swing vote, I don't see that, because it takes a lot more for me to look at them. And integrity and honesty and fairness and the willingness to say to the nation that the PPP party that we don't like won this election, because that is what democracy is about. I think that the people need to see that kind of leadership. And I think that that's the kind of leadership that we need to look for moving forward. And I didn't see it in the AFC. I felt that they betrayed us. And I say that being very aware that Nigel was not part of the process at the time. He had left the leadership of the AFC. He was not part of it. He had been sidestepped by Granger and had backed off. But if democracy in Guyana is more important, if ethics, morality are more important than party allegiance and personal gain, the AFC have not satisfied me as a party that they have demonstrated that. And for that reason, I don't see them at this stage as yet having convinced crossover votes. Those sophisticated voters are looking for integrity and looking for honesty.
I'm afraid that will be the last word. We are running way past our time. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much, as usual, for joining us tonight. It's been a terrific discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure our audience, our viewers and listeners also did. Thank you again. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good night.
Continue, but let's see how
Thank you very much. Pleasure chatting with you, gentlemen. As always.
Thank you. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Good night.